QSO Today, episode 329, Rick Miller, N1RM. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver and their new ID52A dual-band portable, both shipping now. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guthfors-Z1UG, your host. Flex Radio is one of the two platinum sponsors of the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo that will return in March 2021. Please check out the link on this week's show notes page for more information. We will be opening ticketing and registration in December. We at the Expo are very open to some panel discussion ideas as well as workshops. If you have any suggestions, please send me a message through the Contact Us link on the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website. Rick Miller, N1RM's ham radio story, began at McMurdo Station in Antarctica and weaves its way through Russian submarine hunting to operating APRS on the back of a Harley Davidson motorcycle on a grand tour of the United States. N1RM will fill in all of the open spaces in this QSO Today. N1RM, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Rick?
I'm here. Glad to hear you, Eric.
Rick, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I was always kind of a curious kid, and I also happened to have a father who flew in the U.S. Navy, not typical carrier planes, but old transport planes. And one of his duty stations turned out to be Antarctica in the early 60s when I was in junior high school. And I think it was probably around 1963. The phone rang one night when my dad was down in Antarctica. And of course, the world was very large back then. And the only way I could communicate with him was letters that took about 2 weeks to go in each direction. So it was very long delay. And anyway, the phone rang one night. My mom kind of was talking funny, like she was talking to Dad, but saying over and things like that. And then handed the phone to me and asked me if I wanted to talk to my dad. And he sounded a little bit like Donald Duck and everything, but I could tell it was him. But it lasted about 30 seconds. But I think those 30 seconds kind of set an awful lot of things in motion in my life. I had to, first of all, figure out what the heck just happened. And not just what, but how it worked. And that kind of made me realize I had a kind of an innate curiosity about how things work. Not just, oh, that's cool and it's working, but, okay, what's really going on? And I didn't have any ham radio mentors earlier on. I was kind of on my own, but I spent a lot of time in the library after that, going through QST magazine. I remember timing my visits to the library for when the new QST would arrive.
Can I ask a question before you go on? Was that call being transferred to you through like Army Mars, or was that a local ham that was doing a phone patch?
I wasn't aware enough to be able to differentiate between Mars and non-Mars, but I think it was a ham station who was in Missouri. We were in Quonset Point, Rhode Island. And so it was a long distance call. Of course, you had to accept a collect call. And so I seem to remember he was in Missouri, and for some reason he had good propagation to McMurdo that evening. Was able to make the link.
So then, what happened after that?
Well, as I said, was really interested in it. I had no idea really how to go about getting licensed. I think I did get a book on basic introduction to ham radio from the league. But then we moved to California. Being a Navy family, we ended up moving every 3 to 5 years. And but there was a club station at the Naval Air Station in Lemoore, California, where we lived, and a couple of hams that would frequent it, and I would just kind of be there whenever they were, and did take my novice test finally in 1968. And my first call was WN6EJR. And then we moved 4 months later before I had a chance to really do anything about it. I do remember they of course had a Collins S line, it being a military ham radio station. Of course, I was a novice. And in those days, it was 75 watts, crystal controlled CW only. But fortunately, one of the sailors there had an old DX35 that he brought in. So my first QSOs were made on a DX35 transmitter and a 75 S3B receiver. So it was kind of quite a contrast in quality and capability there. So anyway, after that, ironically, we moved back to Rhode Island just a few months after that, and moved into a house, so we weren't living on a naval air station. It was a little easier to get a ham station to get together. I took all my lawn mowing money from the previous 3 years and had my folks write a check to Heathkit for me for, I think it was $235. And that bought me a DX60B and an SB301. Put a dipole on the roof of the house and, worked as far away as North Carolina, probably, on CW. And but then graduated from high school, went to college. Novice, of course, expired in those days pretty quickly. But in between, anyway, I ended up at Purdue University and ended up getting married a couple of years later while I was still in college, and got yet another novice license and operated W9YB. They managed to cobble together a novice station there.
So W9YB was the Purdue University Ham Radio Club?
Yeah, W9 Yogi Bear. It's funny, I just worked them this weekend in sweepstakes.
So let's go back just a little bit in terms of the DX60B and the SB301. When you operated that first rig, do you remember your first contact?
Boy, I sure don't. I was just so nervous that it probably just blew me away. It was probably very short because I struggled with code a lot. I really struggled with Morse code a lot. I was always nervous in a contact. And I was, it was RST. Maybe I could get my state out, which was Rhode Island. So it was did it. And I could usually get that right. It's funny, I do not remember my first QSO.
How old were you when you got your first novice license?
Well, let's see. In 68, I would have been 16 years old.
Did you have contemporaries, kids who were the same age as you were? Did you say that was the Livermore Club station?
No, Lemoore, Lemoore. It's for some reason it's a naval air station in the middle of the desert in California. It's not near any water, but my dad was stationed there.
Is that down in Southern California, like out near the test range, Edwards Air Force Base, places like that?
It's actually in the San Joaquin Valley, kind of almost the geographical center of California, just south of Fresno.
Frankly, I didn't even know there was a naval air station in the San Joaquin Valley.
Neither did I until I lived there.
It seemed to be that since you moved quite a lot, that it was relatively hard to make connections with other kids your age who were also hams. Did that work out maybe in Rhode Island?
I did not really have a firsthand experience, other than the guys that used to hang out at the club station at Lemoore. I didn't have a firsthand experience talking physically to a ham through any of my novice licenses. Whoever was hanging out at the club station I could see, but I didn't have a buddy, that I could call up, or a mentor, an older guy that I could call up and ask a stupid question of. So I kind of missed that whole part of ham radio when I was young.
With your research in the library, looking at QSTs and maybe other electronics books, did you develop an interest in electronics, and did you have the knack?
Yeah, I did. I did. And right, you're referring to the Dilbert knack. I definitely did have the Dilbert knack, yes. My folks were very supportive because, of course, growing up in the 60s, there were a lot of less constructive things I could have gotten involved in. But I really fell in love with science and technology. And I kind of credit, back to even before I knew much about electronics at all. In elementary school, I had a science teacher. Her name was Miss Lee, and she used to wheel a lab cart between the elementary classrooms and teach mainly biology. And so at one time I wanted to be a biologist, but it really got me involved in science and the scientific method and the scientific curiosity. So she kind of planted that seed early on. Then electronics, and then later computers. Actually in high school, I took a computer science course in 1969 with punch cards and everything, and computers also formed a big part of that.
So it's easy to say that ham radio played a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, it's hard to establish the cause effect there, Eric. because I think I had that implanted in me, but it sure was, an enabler, if nothing else. It was another outlet. And, like I said, making contacts in ham radio was a little bit, what's the right word, daunting for me, because, it was all CW, and I wasn't good at CW. I could put stuff together. I built some pretty tough to build kits back then, and a couple of little home brew projects, power supplies and things. But it was hard to get on the air. So I can't say that I looked forward to every QSO, but I sure looked forward to being involved with the technology.
I can relate, absolutely. Let me ask you, after high school, you said you went on to Purdue. What did you study at Purdue?
Electrical engineering. Yep.
There you go. And did you take an advanced degree in electrical engineering?
No, I was a horrible undergrad student, and mainly because I had all this knowledge, but I didn't have a lot of the theoretical underpinnings. And similarly to not having mentors for ham radio, I didn't really have mentors for being an engineer and a disciplined engineer, and what all that involved. I was, my brother and I were the first in our family to go to college. My dad was a career naval officer, but he came up through the ranks. And my mom and dad were both brilliant, hardworking people, but never had, growing up in the Depression, never really had the opportunities to go to college. So I didn't know that there were differential equations involved in electrical engineering. And I eventually figured out how to do it all, but I really struggled in undergrad academically. So but fortunately for me, I've had a lot of luck in my life, and this was one of them. I graduated in 1974, and I was on an ROTC scholarship, which I managed to hang on to through my academic woes. But so I was commissioned a naval officer in 1974, and in '74, I had buddies that had excellent GPAs that could not find a job in engineering. It was the middle of a recession. So I had a guaranteed job. In fact, whether I wanted one or not, I had one. I owed the Navy, depending on what I did, 4 to 6 years of service, at least 4 years of service at that point. There I was in the Navy, had a job, which was good because I already had a wife, and kind of started my career there, making $9,000 a year as a naval ensign.
And what did you do in the Navy?
I went into aviation. My eyes weren't good enough to be a pilot, but I became a naval flight officer. Flew in S-3A Vikings, relatively new airplane at the time. It was a submarine hunter, carrier-based submarine hunter. And I did 2 deployments to the Mediterranean, hunting the evil Russian submarines back then.
Well, that sounds like a lot of Tom Clancy fun.
Yeah, I tell you what, I took the afternoon off to see Hunt for Red October when it first opened. So, yeah, there was a lot of reminiscing there.
You did a stint in the U.S. Navy. What did you do after that?
Well, actually, I don't think we should skip over that, Eric, because...
Well, I don't want to skip over the U.S. Navy if you have more to say about it.
Absolutely, because, well, remember, it was my dad being in the Navy and getting a phone patch that kind of started this whole thing. It turned out I finally got a buddy who was a ham. He was a squadron mate of mine. And in fact, we ended up sharing a stateroom, had a 2-man stateroom in one of our deployments. And he found out I was a ham, and I still had my gear and everything. And his wife was a ham, and they had a tower and an amplifier and everything like that. And we were getting ready to deploy. And he says, "You got to get your license so you can help me run phone patches on the ship." And so by this time I was unlicensed. We were stationed in Jacksonville. So about a month before we deployed, maybe 2 months before we deployed, I got the SB301 out, threw a wire out the window, and just started listening to code practice every night on W1AW. Just did the fast to slow to fast, everything, and got to the point where I was finally up to 13 to 15 words a minute copy. And drove up to Savannah, Georgia, which was, maybe a couple hour drive, sat in the SEC office and actually passed my 13-word minute code license. So that was one of the biggest days of my life right there, because I was finally not going to be a novice. I passed my general exam. They asked me if I wanted to take the advanced exam because they had the advanced class license back then. I said, sure, as long as you promise not to take my general away. And they kind of laughed. They said, no. So anyway, I took the advanced exam and I passed that. And then I took the paperwork to the very nice lady that was up at the front of the room. And she said, well, tell me what your call sign is and I'll give you your interim license certificate. I said, I don't have a call sign. She says, you don't have a novice? I said, no. And she said, well, you have to take the novice test. and if I didn't pass that, they would have taken it all away. So anyway, that was, I was sweating bullets with that, but I managed to pass that as well.
Did you have to take the 5-word per minute code test again?
No. I had credit for the code, thank God. Yeah, that would have been awful. That would have been awful because I probably would have screwed it up. Boy, I'm not going to sleep tonight. Thanks, Eric.
I hate to bring back poor memories. So now you have this advanced class license and you're out to sea. How did that work out there? What was the rig on the ship?
Well, this was in let me get it right, probably 1975. We were on the USS Saratoga and they had set up an awesome ham station there. They actually gave us what at one time had been the auxiliary radio room, which was just under the flight deck all the way on the port side, all the way aft. You've probably seen pictures of aircraft carriers with a big whip sticking out the side. They actually gave us one of those. And it doesn't look like much of an antenna, but it's 90 feet off of the salt water. So it actually does a really, really good job. And we had a Collins S line, of course. We had a 30L1. We had, a good antenna tuner for the whip. And we were a Mars station. So, the other thing was, once again, world was very large, no internet, pretty much paper and pen letters for all these sailors, and no satellite comms, at least for normal human beings. So phone patches were huge. And whenever we were outside the territorial limits in international waters, we would be running phone patches whenever the bands were open. And I would run, my buddy and I think we were the only two really active hams on the whole ship, even though there were about 3,000 people on it. We would, fly a couple of missions during the day and then stay up as late as the bands would stay open running phone patches, and the line would be going down the passageway sometimes 20, 30 deep. It really, it was kind of an interesting way to learn about humanity because you're forced to eavesdrop on conversations that you're trying not to pay attention to, but you just learn a lot about people and about different situations that folks have and run into. And I'd kind of led a sheltered childhood, and that was a big growing up experience for me. So that was one way ham radio contributed to my education in a non-technical way.
And now this message from ICOM America. Ham for the holidays. ICOM's new ID52A and IC705 give hours of fun and enjoyment working your favorite bands this holiday season. ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio is the ID52A. The ID52A is a larger radio with a larger color display and louder audio. This VHF-UHF digital transceiver is much more than a replacement for the ID51A, but it also is a new way of communicating. The color display is 2.3 inches for exceptional viewability, and the audio is 80% louder. This multifunction dual-band D-Star transceiver supports DR mode for easy access to local repeaters based on internal GPS information as well as terminal access point modes. The ID52A has Bluetooth for audio and data control, providing improved mobility and control. And for the first time in amateur radio industry, you can now send photos from a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed ranges of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has a VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode. Integrated GPS receiver, including grid square location. Micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it's IPX7 waterproof. The ID-52A is the perfect companion to the IC-705. Both use compatible batteries and headsets, and you can also use the same Android app for D-Store operation. The IC-705 is the perfect sidekick to the ID-52A for hams that like to enjoy what both the great indoors and outdoors have to offer. This is the perfect QRP companion, base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. Other features include 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts out with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with 13.8 volts DC supplied. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, touchscreen display, micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, speaker microphone. The HM243 comes standard, supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the IC-705 is, of course, the optional backpack, the LC-192, with a special compartment for your IC-705 and room for accessories for soda activations or a day of social distancing in the park. The IC-705 is now shipping. Follow the link in the ICOM banner ad in this week's show notes, or go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on these fine rigs. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. I would think that married corpsmen who are out at sea, I would imagine there's a certain amount of stress on both sides of the conversation.
Yes. Absolutely. And to try to stay emotionally detached when, there was a breakup or a divorce or a dishonesty or, an infidelity going on was, it was sobering. It was very sobering. But I felt really good about the service that I was doing because I know it made a lot of difference in a positive way to a lot of people. So that was... That added a lot of extra work, but it was a labor of love. And the other cool thing about it was we were so popular that on Navy ships, they have a ship store and where you can buy stuff, and any profits from that actually go into a recreation fund. So a ship that size, gets many thousands of dollars in the recreation fund every year. And they would always have a meeting, and they were always trying to give us more money for better equipment. So we ended up buying a TR-4CW as an auxiliary rig. And because we were on Mars capable, we ended up with a Henry 4K amplifier. And of course, we had to buy the transformer to convert the weird ship power to the power that the Henry 4K needed. So we had plenty of power on the Mars frequencies. Plenty of folks back home willing to be the other end of the call. The other interesting thing was the plane I flew also had an HF rig in it. It had a 1 kW HF rig in it, even though it was a relatively small carrier aircraft. And a very weird notch antenna, part of the skin of the aircraft that was loaded up as an antenna. And that was normally used for a data link. But whenever that data link net was down, I would tune it up on the ham bands, and 20,000 feet, even a lousy antenna seemed to work pretty good, at least back then. And would sometimes have a chat with my wife and run phone patches for the other 3 guys on the airplane through the HF radio there as well. So there was actually the reason I didn't want to skip over my Navy experience is because it's when I first really, really became a ham and really got into it.
Well, I wouldn't want you to skip over that because I think that's a great story. Did you drop sonar buoys and all that other kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah. It was actually pretty interesting back then because the Soviets at the time were very active in submarines. And there were the interesting thing about anti-submarine warfare is that even in peacetime, you can do most of your mission. You can do the hunter part, right? You heard of the term hunter-killer. Well, you can do the hunter part like all day, every day. And so we ended up staying pretty sharp. Finding a submarine is really, really hard. And when you're pitting a 24, 25-year-old lieutenant junior grade against a 20-year experienced submarine captain, it's a little asymmetrical, but we did okay. It was very, very interesting. It was fascinating and exciting, the flying and the mission.
And how long did you stay in the service?
I stayed in for 5 years, mainly because it wasn't scratching my technical itch enough. I mean, the systems I worked in, the aircraft and everything were great, but I was an unrestricted line officer, which means I was being groomed. Ultimately, in my career goal was to command a squadron, and I wanted to be an engineer. I look at all the stuff my commanding officer had to do, and I said, if that's what they're trying to get me to do, I really don't want to do that. So I got out after 5 years.
And what did you do after that?
I went to work for Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics, where they built submarines in Groton, Connecticut. And I was an engineer there. I didn't know it at the time because I wasn't familiar with the term, but I guess I was a systems engineer. I did some analysis of sonar systems, and I did a lot of software for the ship control systems, as well as for submarine steering and diving trainers.
Did the General Dynamics job scratch your technical itch?
Yeah, it really did. And the other thing was, at that point, I said, I really had still was filled with regret over how I kind of didn't live up to my potential in my undergrad, and I wanted to kind of make up for that. So I started and got a master's degree through an extension of RPI, and that was in computer science.
No differential equations there.
No, but finite math. So abelian groups and monoids and abstract algebra. So
one of the things you mentioned earlier, that CW was not one of your strong points, although you got your code speed up in order to get the general and the advanced license. But it's my understanding that you're pursuing CW again. How are you doing that?
Well, actually, it's funny. I guess I made a lot of mistakes when I was young, or I didn't feel adequate when I was young. And so I spent the rest of my life trying to make up for that. And actually, before I got out of the Navy, I passed the 20-word-a-minute code test and got an extra. I did that at the Atlanta Hamfest. I guess that would have been the late 70s. That was when the FCC used to visit Hamfests, and it was also when the FCC was temporarily not allowed to charge any fees for anything. So all I had to do was get up early one morning and try to pass the test, and I did. So I actually worked really hard. I definitely had the 13-word-a-minute barrier. And it was definitely a barrier for me, because once I got over it, I got up to 18 words a minute pretty good. And then 20 words a minute with some practice for the extra exam. But I never was a big CW operator, so it wasn't something that still was real easy for me. But then I got into contesting. And before I built the beautiful station that I just completed this past summer, my only station was in a 4-story townhouse with a stealth antenna going out, fortunately, a tree about halfway at 80 meters away from me, and an antenna tuner on the end of it. And so 100 watts, challenged antenna. The only way you're going to do DX and the only way you're going to contest is CW. You just the signal, the power spectral density, you just can't get it with phone. So I got into CW, and because I started using it many evenings a week, I just got better at it, and it was so enabling. Once I got to the point where I could do a CW QSO without breaking a sweat. It was fun, because I got DXCC with that setup in that townhouse. What was really fun was it was sort of a full circle event for me. In the course of getting that DXCC over probably 3 or 4 years, I actually made a contact with a Russian station in Antarctica. So it was my second QSO within Antarctica.
That's what you would recommend for any operator that has a compromised system who wants to operate contests, is to get on CW.
Yeah, it's at least a 3 dB. It feels like you can do the math in terms of, optimal detection and things like that, but it's a several dB advantage to do CW. I actually teach ham radio classes for our club. I've taught several. When we get into different modes and we talk about bandwidth and we don't use the term power spectral density because that makes people run screaming from the room. But if you look at how little noise you're letting in to your receiver once you narrow down that filter, and the fact that the carrier coming through is at full power whenever it's on, it's just such an advantage. And you don't have to sit and have a 10-minute, and if you've got a station like mine, you're not going to have a 10-minute QSO with a guy in Antarctica because you can barely hear each other. You're just trying to get call signs and signal reports through. So it's not like you need to be a good rag chewer on CW, but it's very enabling. And so for contesting in DX, I can do 30 to 35 word a minute contest QSOs pretty reliably, very few repeats. I use Morse Runner and a couple of other applications to keep that speed up. I'm not a great rag chewer on CW still, but it was sort of a marriage of convenience that turned into a labor of love when I got back into CW out of necessity, and then really fell in love. And now CW contesting is one of my favorite things to do.
Now, I saw the CW Ops logo on your QRZ page. What are you doing with CW Ops?
Well, I took the intermediate course in CW Ops a couple of years ago, the CW Academy, which is just fabulous. It's an incredible service that CW Ops does for the community. And then, and I did okay, and I got a little bit better. And then I took the advanced class at the advice of the criteria they had on their webpage. Wasn't sure that I was really ready for it, but because, as I said, I can do CW contest QSOs all day at very high speeds, but I'm not a great rag chewer. It taught me some things. I had always said we got to concentrate on receiving. I could always send, even with a straight key, I could always send pretty reliably. But it turns out that practicing sending really helps. And they really made me do a lot of that in the advanced class. And so I actually made huge progress, even at this relatively late stage of my life. The other thing that dawned on me going through some of their practice files, which, I'm going to try to pass this concept along to everybody else that I talk to that is struggling with CW, is that if you go back to when you learned to read, you didn't start out by reading Tolstoy, right? I mean, you were reading very limited vocabulary, see, spot, run, this is dead, run, spot, run, etc. So a lot of repetition. So you need to do that same kind of practice with CW, so that you get. So now when you sit down and you read a book and you see the word spot, you don't say SPOT. You see the word spot, and you just your mind just processes it without any real active involvement in the decoding of it. And if you do some of these sort of primer practices, I found that immensely helpful to me to gradually build my CW word vocabulary rather than just doing the letter by letter decoding in my head.
So it's kind of like whole word language or whole word reading, right? So that you're actually hearing the whole word, not the individual letters.
Right. And it's really, really tough to get there because it's hard to do below 20 words a minute because it takes so long for you to know what the last letter is. And the trouble that I always have is I get, you kind of have this search tree going on in your brain and you hear the first four letters and then you try to use context and everything to say, well, I think it's this word. And so you say, okay, that's the word. And then the next letter that comes doesn't match. So you need to be able to string it all together so that, your sort of autonomous attention span can span it without having to make too many corrections or backtracks.
Now, do you use a keyer or a bug or a side swiper or something like that? What's your device of choice for sending?
I use an iambic keyer. Now, I know there's a lot of differing opinions as to whether the squeeze keying and the iambic, dual paddle aspect of it works, but it's the first automatic device that I use, other than a straight key, and so I've just gotten used to it. And the squeeze key part of it, irrespective of what kind of an advantage it gives to me, I find it a lot more relaxing than trying to always move a single paddle back and forth.
And which iambic keyer paddles do you use?
Well, actually, my old standby is just the original bencher. I have a bencher that's I've had to bend and rebend a couple of times because it's gotten dropped and tossed around and taken to field days and stuff like that. And it's kind of what you get used to. My favorite key, however, and the one that's on my operating desk, is a handmade key by Mike March that I bought at Dayton. And it's a beautiful Art Deco base and everything, and it's got the magnetic tension adjustments on it. And it's not only a pleasure to operate, it really looks cool. So there's the artistic aspect of it too.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. Rick, you mentioned earlier, and I saw on your QRZ page, that you actually have a new rig and a new setup. Can you describe a little bit about what that is?
It's interesting. When I decided to get serious about ham radio back in the townhouse, I was looking around for rigs, and I got almost got an Omni 7. I'd had a Ten-Tech earlier and really liked the Ten-Tech rigs. And then I heard, somebody said, well, you should look at the K2. And I said, what's a K2? I'd never heard of Elecraft. And so I was looking at the K2, and they announced the K3. And there's something about Elecraft and their way of doing business and their technology, and the fact that the designer was a ham that, you might actually work on the air sometimes. And so I actually ordered a K3, and then I learned about Elecraft delivery times on new rigs. It took me about 7 months to get it. And in the interim, I had a very capable Yaesu, 857, very small rig, does everything. And and so because it's a small rig and it does everything and it doesn't cost that much money, it does its, okay, but not great. And then I got the Elecraft K3, put it together, and all of a sudden I heard what a really good receiver could do. So anyway, I got a K3 back at the townhouse, and that has moved with me to this place. What happened was, about the time I retired, for a long time, because of the townhouse situation and because I have the most amazing wife in the world, she says, we got to find a place for you to put a ham station. And so, we were looking at places. They were kind of far away. I ended up finding a place 5 miles from my townhouse with 3 acres, and it had one building on it, and it's a 2-car garage with a 1-bedroom apartment. So it's a similar setup to what you were describing that you have now, Eric, where it's got a full bath, a kitchen, a sitting area, and then the bedroom is where my ham station and lab is. So that's the building. It's got optical, fiber optic internet. I've got a generator. It's just like if you were sitting down and built a, kind of a single or 2 transmitter ham shack, this would be it. And it's really well made. It's not a ramshackle building. My previous employer was shutting down a site, and they had a tower there, And I'd kind of noticed it before. It was tilted over on a stand, most of the time. And I was looking at getting a Tashin DX70. And one day I go by this building, and because they were abandoning the building, and I said, well, maybe the tower's available. And I look at it, and it's an old Tri-X DX70. I mean, but we're talking old. My guess is it's about 40 years old. So the Tri-X designs, are now in with Tashin. So it's the same design. I talked to the facilities manager, and he said, well, yeah, we're just going to scrap it. I said, well, I don't want to do anything illegal, but can I have the tower? And he said, sure. So I got a crane in there because it weighs over 2,000 pounds. And fortunately, a buddy had a high capacity trailer. He got it put up here, and it fit inside the garage at my new place here. And it needed a lot of work. It had galvanizing that was, chipped away. It had some very weird modifications done to it. I think it had been a defense research project support. So it had a lot of non-standard stuff on it. The cables were in tough shape. The pulleys were in tough shape. And so I spent almost 2 years refurbishing that tower because, I had part-time jobs and full-time jobs during that period of time, and got it put together. So now after convincing Fairfax County that going back and forth that it wouldn't fall over after I put it up through all sorts of engineering analysis and soil samples. I had to have a drilling rig out to take core samples down to 25 feet and just all sorts of silliness like that. But at any rate, 9 foot deep by 4 by 4 piece of concrete, and bolted it on there. And so now I have 70-foot tower that's about 350 feet from the shack. So I buried hard line out to there. And I put a stepper DB18E on top of it. I'm a pretty conservative guy, so I didn't want to get the giant thing up there. And it looked like the DB18 had a good enough performance for me. And so that's what I've got there. I guess we'll probably talk about it some more, but along the way, I got associated with ACOM, the amplifier company in Bulgaria. And so I have an ACOM 2000 amp. And so for the first time in my life, I have an amplifier and an antenna that can turn after first getting licensed over 50 years ago.
I saw on your website that you also have a company called Reston Applied Technology.
Well, it's actually just an independent small business that I started, about 3 years ago. Yeah, 2017. In April of 2017 is when I formed the company. And about 6 months prior to that, another very good friend and excellent mentor of mine, Mike Lonicky, whose current call is W4RN, he had gotten me into the K4VV superstation here, which is about 15 miles west of here. And it's just an immense station. Unfortunately, K4VV is now a silent key, and he wasn't really doing very well at the time, but it was a super multi station with, all sorts of aluminum and everything like that. So anyway, that's when I first saw an ACOM 2000. They had an ACOM 2000 at each of the 3 operating positions. Loved the amplifier. It's just kind of, it just kind of matched what I thought an amplifier should be. So at any rate, one of them broke down, and I already, I've always kept my hand in electronics throughout my career, throughout my life pretty much. And so I said, well, let me take a look at it. And there's Val at ACOM, who is a ham. Somehow he managed to answers every email that goes to support at ACOM. And I told him about the problem, and I said, where can we send this? And he says, well, if you like to look at things, you could probably fix it yourself. And he said, he'll help me. So anyway, I hooked up my scope to the stepper motor drivers because it has stepper motors in there to tune the amplifier. And I was able to isolate each phase and show how there was one phase missing, and figured out exactly which power transistor or phase driver was bad. And I sent him all these scope shots and everything like that. And I got an email back from him, and he says, "You look like you're pretty good at this. Would you like to fix other ACOM amplifiers?" So that's how my business was born, and I guess the rest is history. So I formed Reston Applied Technology specifically for that. I do have a website, and I do take on other jobs. I have also, contracted with my previous employer on a couple of jobs part-time, but it's pretty much fixing ACOM amps. And I do their warranty repair for all the amps sold through a ham radio outlet. And I also I'm a member of the Potomac Valley Radio Club, which is a huge contesting club. So there's lots of ACOMs in this region. And, word of mouth has kept me plenty busy. The amplifiers are extremely reliable. They're wonderful to work on. They do things the way I would have done them if I were as smart as them, I guess is one way to put it. So I find them very easy to work on, and I learn a lot every time I fix one.
Well, you bring up a very interesting idea. I don't think I've ever discussed it with any of the guests on the QSO Today podcast, and that is that hams like you have years and years of experience and a lot of hands-on experience. And when you retire, it kind of seems like, well, heck, that experience is now not being used. Do you think, given the number of hams and the number of ham radio companies that are selling radios of all kinds, that for a retired amateur radio operator with a lot of hands-on experience, that doing the kind of stuff that you're doing with ACOM amplifiers, but with other stuff, that might be an interesting part-time pastime to spend in your retirement years? Is that something that you would advocate for other people as well?
Yes, I guess the short answer is absolutely. I don't know that it's for everybody. One thing that I guess we need to watch out for is that hams are great at making things work. Most hams understand how to make things work, but a lot of hams just kind of try a whole bunch of different things, and when they start working, they think they fixed it. But they're not really sure why, or really if it's fixed, or if it's just some other thing changed to make it work. So I think we have a responsibility to first educate ourselves, and then educate others to make sure that you don't in this day of the internet, where so much data is out there. I'll call it data, because it's not really information until you've processed it and validated it. You can see, and there's an awful lot of stuff out there that's just not only inaccurate, but just plain wrong and really bad advice for new hams. And so I think it's important for those who have maybe had a little bit more disciplined education, or have taken the time to really dive down, close to first principles, to at least understand the limits of their own knowledge before they dive in and start, guiding others. I'm a little hard over on that, and it's probably not a mainstream view, but it's sort of a little bit of a pet peeve of mine.
I would agree with you 100%, but I think I might also add, and probably you would agree with this, that in these days, like everything else, it seems to me that focusing on a specific product and brand is probably the best way to be successful, probably from the repetition of seeing it more than once, but also because it's the best way to get a reputation of being the guy that knows how to fix every FT101 that's ever crossed his bench, in your case an ACOM 2000. That focus on a specific product and brand probably would bring the most success, and not only financial, but also in terms of being actually able to understand and fix it.
Absolutely. 100%. That's, and there's a couple of other dimensions that are especially good to me that you didn't mention. One is, one of course is I can stock parts for ACOM amps. Previous folks that did service for ACOM in this capacity would not do component level troubleshooting. They would have to stock boards, which is expensive. Boards are a lot more expensive than a little bag of transistors. It's amazing how cheap. I think I fixed an amp one time that had a whole lot of stuff wrong with it. So the labor charges, even though my labor rates are really low, were considerable. And I think I replaced a whole bunch of parts. I think the total parts cost was $12. So I can stock parts for this line of amplifiers, and I know which ones tend to fail more often, so I can pre-order those and keep those in stock without having a huge inventory investment. And the other one is I'm retired. I'm not looking for another full-time income or full-time job. I want to get on the air. I want to go on motorcycle rides. I want to do a bunch of other things. So I don't want something to grow too big. And so concentrating on amplifiers that are generally pretty reliable, that are well designed and not too hard to fix, and that I can stock parts for, it's just, in almost every dimension, a perfect match for me.
I think the way that I discovered you, Rick, is that you wrote an article about APRS I think it was for QST Magazine, on a cross-country ride on a Harley Davidson. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my wife and I have been, we each have Harleys, and we still ride quite a bit. But I sort of had a bucket list trip planned, and in 2000, good grief, was it 2016? I guess it was. We planned a basically circumnavigation of the continental United States. We live in Virginia, Northern Virginia. So we wanted to go all the way across the Northern Plains, pick up the Pacific Coast Highway, basically in the state of Washington, and take it all the way down to San Diego, and then back across the desert, come up through the Utah parks and everything. So we basically did about a 9,600-mile motorcycle ride over 6 weeks. And everybody asks us, well, did you get those radios so we can talk to each other? And our comeback is pretty much the same. He says, if you're going to go on it's really nice to go on a 10,000-mile vehicle trip with your spouse and never get in an argument. So I do all the navigation. She loves to have me lead. She's an excellent rider in her own right and certainly goes off on her own quite a bit. But she really likes just following me and not really worrying about where we are and just enjoying the experience. And so if I agree to do all the navigation and leading, and she agrees to never comment if I make a wrong turn, which I do sometimes. So anyway, we don't have radios and everything. I've never put a ham radio on the motorcycle. I figured there's already plenty of things to get distracted by that can kill you on a motorcycle. So I never really added that aspect to it. It just didn't seem right for me. But I wanted to do something, and I'd gotten interested in APRS a number of years ago, and I had a small digipeater and did a lot of research and actually wrote some APRS decoders on my own in Linux and things like that. So I said, well, I wonder how good APRS coverage around the country is. I said, this is a great opportunity for an experiment. So I actually put an HT. In fact, I think I still have it here. Well, I don't have it with me right now. It was a Yaesu APRS capable HT and a small amplifier on it, and a quarter wave whip in the tour pack on the back of my bike. And I hooked it up with a battery voltage sensing switch so that it would turn on when I turned on the bike, and it would stay on for about a minute after I stopped and then shut itself off. So I literally didn't have to touch the radio the whole time. But what I did is every evening when we checked into a motel, I'd get on the internet and I would download from the APRS information system, APRS.fi, all of the raw packets that had been picked up from my motorcycle and made it to the internet. And so I built these huge data files as I went along. And when I got done, I did an analysis and kind of plotted it using KML on a map and everything to show where I was when packets were received and made it to the APRSIS system. And it showed how remarkably good this ad hoc sort of volunteer system that just sort of grew, how great coverage it is around the U.S. The article shows that map and I have it color coded where there's a gap in coverage. A couple of surprises in the middle of the desert, in New Mexico. There's a 10,000 foot mountain with an APRS digipeater on it. I used that for 3 days. I didn't need any other digipeaters except that single one. As we were going around the parks in that part of the country, yet going through more densely populated areas, say in the low areas of Louisiana, eastern Texas, where it's swamps and everything's down low, there were gaps in coverage there, so sometimes significant gaps there, even though there was a lot more people per square mile. There weren't any mountains. So there were a couple of really interesting lessons learned from that. And I put it together into an article that, I was a little disappointed that they cut it down quite a bit, because I think they lost some of the science that I put in there in terms of, doing the coverage analysis and things like that. But maybe I should have submitted it to QEX instead of QST. I don't know. But at any rate, it was great to get published, to have that as sort of a souvenir of the trip.
Do you have that map in electronic format or PDF format?
I do.
If you don't mind, if you send it to me, then I'll put it on a link so that people can actually click on the link on the show notes page and actually see the map.
Sure. Absolutely.
I'm happy to host it up there. And if you have the white paper that goes with all the science, then I'm also happy to post that as well so that folks can download that as a PDF.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I can just put the original article in there. It's not like there's a lot of statistical analysis and everything. It's just there's a lot of details that didn't make it into the final article.
Go to the show notes page and they can actually look at the map and download the article if they'd like to see it in its entirety.
Okay.
I think that sounds like a great exploration. When you were talking about the Harley Davidson, I think some of us think that, maybe rightly so, that motorcycle riding is relatively dangerous. On a Harley, is that a different experience than maybe on a Honda?
Not in terms of risk, because the risks aren't from the motorcycle or the motorcycle type, really, unless you get something that's got enough horsepower that you can accelerate it out from underneath you. The risks, I highly recommend anybody that's interested in motorcycle riding to take the Motorcycle Safety Foundation. They have a beginner's course, and they also have an advanced course that my wife and I take periodically, even today, even though we have hundreds of thousands of miles under our belt, because it's defensive driving. You have to, because you will never win a collision, you have to make sure that you avoid a collision. You need to anticipate what other drivers may do. You need to be a little bit paranoid, and you need to be calm and well rested and not impaired in any way when you ride, just to give yourself a better chance. I mean, everything's about statistics. There are very few sure things anywhere in the natural world. And so what you're trying to do is increase the odds of, it's kind of like what we're going through with the pandemic right now. You can follow all the guidelines and still get the disease, but you can certainly improve your odds by doing intelligent things.
I think the biggest problem that I have with motorcycles is I don't see them when they pass me on the right. For example, you don't see them until they pass you, and you're just kind of thankful that you didn't kill somebody on the road.
You learn not to spend time in blind spots. In fact, there's people that probably think I'm showing off, but when I'm passing a vehicle, that I tend to accelerate very rapidly past them and not spend a lot of time beside them. Just little things like that it's just sort of self-preservation.
I somehow remember that one of the things you're supposed to do on the road as a motorcyclist is to kind of stay on the right side of the lane so that if I'm looking through my rearview mirror, I see you. For some reason, I don't see that. Maybe it's just, the way that motorcycle riders around here are trained. I think the highest death rate in this country on motorcycles is pizza delivery drivers.
Oh, geez. Yeah, because they're in a hurry and they've got 100 other things in their mind, and they're probably trying to take shortcuts. I can't imagine.
Like sidewalks.
Yeah.
Entering parking lots from the exit rather than the entrance.
Well, and just not being seen. I think you hit on it. Not being seen is the biggest cause of motorcycle incidents.
Right. They're fast and invisible.
Right. Well, and not just that, but they may see you, but it doesn't register that to them that you are moving at the same rate as a car, because you don't look like a car, So, I mean, unless you need their level of consciousness has to be above a certain amount for that to register, that you are another vehicle and not a bicycle, for instance.
What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
Whew. Boy, that would have been a good one to send me last week. I am really, really bullish about ham radio right now. Let me digress, because let me draw a parallel. I've always been interested in space science, and I live near the Smithsonian Institution, so I often get to go to panel sessions, or used to before shutdowns and things like that. And one I went to was a panel session with Scott Crossfield. He's a brilliant engineer, and he later got into helping in serving on boards of universities and helping in science and technology education with, like places like Caltech and, not your run-of-the-mill outfits. And there was a Q&A at the end, and I was working on my doctorate at the time, and I had a question that he seemed like the exact right guy to answer. And so I said, with there being such a huge rate of increase in the number of things that we need to learn as engineers and scientists, because, when you think about in the last few decades how much has been invented and discovered, did he find that students were not as well grounded in the fundamentals, because you sort of jump in, in your research sources, and you jump in at the top and you see all this stuff and the underpinnings, the Maxwell's equations and things like that get lost. And he stopped. He didn't answer right away. And I remember Walter Cronkite said, "Do you need him to repeat the question?" He says, "No, that's a thoughtful question and it requires a thoughtful answer." I remember those words exactly from him. And he said, "The students that are graduating today are the best, smartest, and most well-educated students in engineering and science in history." And so I think a lot of us as old timers in ham radio saying, these young kids don't know anything about how to click a mouse button on FT8. And I see a lot of that. And I know a lot of that is sort of grousing in normal, old guy stuff. But I teach ham radio courses, and I teach both youngsters and people later in life getting into ham radio. Their level of curiosity and ability to absorb and ultimately, I think, contribute to the hobby is as good as anything that was, back in the 60s when I first got started. So I'm very bullish about ham radio. I think we certainly have challenges in terms of how we're going to justify the amount of spectrum that we have. In working on these amplifiers, I do have a couple of commercial customers. So there are commercial customers for HF. And fortunately, that it hasn't become so mainstream that there's going to, I foresee, too much emphasis or pressure, commercial pressure on the HF spectrum, but there certainly is at the higher frequencies. I think the other challenge that we have in terms of public service, because I also am involved in APRS, the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, is that there's a lot of bureaucracy, and I'll explain what I mean by that, involved in areas that there didn't used to be. There's a lot of more memorandums of understanding. There's a lot more training. So that's all good. We know what to expect from each other. We know how emergency organizations do business. But I think what I see happening in some areas, in some cases, is that ham radio emergency operators are basically becoming unpaid supernumeraries to emergency organizations. And what we're losing there is what I call the orthogonality of ham radio. In other words, we do things differently in terms of how we communicate and the equipment and frequencies and modes that we use compared to, say, a large county like Fairfax County that I live in, where they have this incredibly sophisticated infrastructure. So if we just become other operators of that infrastructure, we're losing our unique contribution. Excuse me. If we, maybe all we have is an FM repeater in the area, but if it's well located and on independent power and not relying on the internet, for instance, for linking, it may be able to serve in a disaster where, the infrastructure crashes or whatever in the county. So I think we have to remember that there are some unique technological aspects that ham radio brings to public service, and not just try to be clones of the agencies that we're serving. Get on the air. I mean, that's pretty much not just returning hams, but get on the air, get licensed. If you've been a ham before, you can get licensed in a month. If they don't know how, give them my email and I'll tell them how.
Will do.
So, and then get a radio and get off the internet. Don't go to eHams. Don't go to the websites that show you all these antennas and should I buy this antenna or that antenna. If you're getting on VHF, build yourself a 19-inch whip ground plane out of an SO239 connector and stick it on a fence post and see how that works. It might be all you need. And then go from there. But I think what happens is hams these days tend to treat building their station the same way they treat shopping for anything these days. They get on Amazon, they go to all the websites and they learn, the 10 best things to have and everything like that. And you go to customer reviews, which, is crowdsourcing customer reviews is kind of okay, but it's just fraught with inaccuracies and biases. The way to figure out what you need for ham radio is to try something, get on the air. One of the exercises I do for one of the ham radio classes is on the way to the class on practical antennas. I stop by the hardware store and I buy everything we need to build a 10-meter dipole, and we build a 10-meter dipole in class, and then we put it on the air before the evening's out and use it. And I think the total cost is about $12. That sort of goes in with what I was saying before, is that there are things that we can do that don't require a lot of investment that are still very effective. So, I kind of went off.
I think it's important, Rick. I think I would add, join a ham radio club and find a mentor. All of us older mentors, I've been in almost 50 years, we have all kinds of junk, even working rigs that we would loan or give away to a new ham just to get them on the air. So it doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be a brand new rig if you can't afford a new rig. There's got to be plenty of Elmers out there that have lots of stuff that's sitting, gathering dust.
Right, and I went kind of through that experience, and I mentioned Mike Lonicky, who is one of the best ambassadors to ham radio I've ever seen, W4RN. He makes his station available at his place he's got everything connected remotely, and he's got buddies all over the world that he lets call in and operate his station even during contests and everything. And he's, when he's gotten done with this particular receiver array, he says, would you like this receiver array controller? So even in the last 5 years, even though I've been licensed for over 50 years, I'm finding mentors like him that are still helping me along. And then I'm paying that forward because there's some new hams that are, old as well as young in our class. And I'll invite them over to my shack and I'll walk them around and I'll show them why I did things. I'll show them my bench and I'll say, hey, could you use this? So absolutely. Clubs are very important. I've always belonged to at least one club. I think I've now belonged to about 3. I've served as an officer in clubs, and they have been a huge resource for me in improving my abilities as a ham.
Rick, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was really a pleasure, and I loved hearing your ham radio story. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
It's a pleasure being here, and thanks for all you do for ham radio.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Rick. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in N1RM in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I'm updating the webpage as we have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.